Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are located, and welcome to ICCR's webinar on renewable energy and human rights, the investor case. My name is Christina Herman, and I coordinate investor work on the climate crisis at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. ICCR is a coalition of some 300 global faith and values-based institutional investors that work together to engage the world's largest corporations on a broad range of social and environmental issues affecting communities in the US and globally. We feel strongly that justice must be at the heart of the societal changes needed to address the climate crisis and are working to explore ways that we can collectively ensure a just transition as we shift to a clean energy economy. To make the massive shifts needed with the urgency required, we believe the transition must take into consideration the concerns and needs of everyone affected, particularly the most vulnerable. The deployment and expansion of renewable energy technologies will play an integral role in reducing our collective carbon footprint, but can come at a cost for workers and communities if companies do not ensure respect for human rights in their operations and throughout their supply chains. Since 2010, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center has identified nearly 200 allegations of human rights abuse related to renewable energy projects, related to more than 25 companies. In June, the Resource Center released the first human rights benchmark of the largest wind and solar energy companies in the world, finding that most lack the essential human rights policies to avoid abuse. This webinar, which we are hosting jointly with the Resource Center, will examine the findings of the report and discuss how investors can use the benchmark to engage with companies on their human rights policies and practices. Our first speaker will be Stephen Heim, who is a managing director for Boston Common Asset Management, an investment manager and a leader in global impact initiatives. Experience in the responsible investment field. From 2007 to 2019, he chaired the advocacy subcommittee of the Investors and Indigenous Peoples Working Group. Stephen served on the advisory group for the Renewable Energy and Human Rights Benchmark and serves on the International Joint Committee for the Sustainability Leadership Standard for photovoltaic modules and photovoltaic inverters. Next up will be Marty Flax, who is the Deputy Director and Head of the North American Office at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, where she also oversees the organization's work in Africa and the Middle East and on natural resources. She previously spent more than 10 years working for the US government at the State Department and National Security Council. She joined the Resource Center in May of 2017. Jens Christian Roth is head of the Ørsted Responsible Business Partner Program. He has responsibility for rolling out the Ørsted Code of Conduct for Business Partners, which enables Ørsted to collaborate with suppliers and joint venture partners on how to improve their social, environmental, and ethical performance. Also, he has responsibility for Ørsted's corporate approach on respecting human rights. I want to thank the presenters for their willingness to share their perspectives and expertise with us today. All speakers have offered to make their emails available for follow-up questions, and their contact information will be available in a slide at the close of the webinar. Before I turn this over to our first speaker, I want to offer a few housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and contact emails for the speakers. You will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. We will hear from each of our speakers, and then we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes after the presentation for questions. Please enter your questions in the questions box, not in the chat feature, at any time during the webinar. You can find the questions tab on the control panel of GoToWebinar. And now I'll hand the webinar over to Stephen Heim, who will get us started with an investor perspective on the benchmark report.
Yes, thank you and welcome everyone. Boston Common, myself, are very pleased to participate in the webinar. Boston Common is a global investor, both US and non-US companies. One of our holdings is Ørsted. We bought Ørsted because of its leading position in wind power. And so we're very pleased to be on the webinar with Ørsted today. We're also members of ICCR and have been active in ICCR in many issue areas there, including human rights, and also in leading dialogues with companies on Indigenous rights issues. So to see renewable energy come into this space is very important for renewable energy to have a long-term benefit to the investors, also the companies and their countries that get the renewable energy, but also for the communities where they're located. And that's been a key issue over the years with a number of companies in their operations. If they don't have community support, the projects could be blocked, they could be delayed, which leads to other costs for the projects, or even stopped. And that's happened to some projects and wind power projects in Mexico. Other projects impacts are on reputation and involvement in human rights abuses. The benchmark report has very good methodology and framework that I helped work on as part of the advisory committee, and really recommend that everyone look at that as a way for evaluating the companies in the report plus other companies in the renewable energy area. One of the key areas for companies to consider and for investors is the concept of, for communities and particular Indigenous peoples, a self-determination and the right of free, prior, and informed consent, also the initials of FPIC. In talking with a Sami representative, Mateus Aren, several years ago at the UN, one of the things he said about free, prior, and informed consent, which has always stuck with me, he said, you talk, you lose. That means if you talk to companies, you lose because they'll use that as a evidence that they had consultation, and therefore the project can go forward. So he said, you talk, you lose. So it's important to look at consent and approval versus consultation. I know that's a controversial issue, especially in the banking area and the whole equator principles. But that's a key thing we would like to recommend investors to look at, is this issue of free, prior, and informed consent. First Peoples Worldwide has put together EPIC due diligence questionnaire that is very helpful for both investors and companies in evaluating projects. So sustainability really must also include, besides the environmental benefit, the climate benefit, also the impact on human rights. A few company examples where there have been problems is the Lake Turkana wind power project in Kenya, where the issue there was on land rights and Indigenous peoples, and the role of the wind power companies in developing the project versus the approval or consent or compensation of those who were relocated for the project, in particular the Maasai people there. And Google was a early supporter of the project, and Meredith Benton led advocacy with Google several years ago on this issue. And then other areas are in solar power in Central America, wind power in Mexico and Oaxaca, other projects in other parts of the world, whether it be geothermal power and others, are all areas that are critical for investors to consider on looking at the human rights aspects of the projects. And then Boston Common has also done advocacy with companies in the lithium area, which is used for making batteries and a key for electric vehicles, with SQM and Albemarle, and their operations in Chile and their relations with Indigenous peoples in Chile. I think two things I'd like to close with are just the importance of looking at partnership for companies with the local community, as their projects may be there for decades. They want to expand the projects, they need the support of the local people, and also whether they can be part owners in the project. I think that's a new area which could, for investors to look at. The last thing I'd like to note is in the report itself by the Business Human Rights Resource Center, there's I think about 16 companies, but for investors to think bigger and broader and apply this to the whole RE100, Renewable Energy 100% commitment to the companies in our portfolios, to ask them in making their RE100 commitment to also respect human rights, and they can use the report as a good framework for doing that. So that's it for now in my presentation. Look forward to our further discussion.
Stephen, thanks very much. That's great, and a great point about RE100, especially for investors who are engaging companies involved in that. Next up, we have Marty Flax to talk to us about the report itself.
Thanks so much, Christina, and thanks to ICCR for co-hosting this event with us. It's a pleasure to be able to present to you our work on renewable energy and human rights. And I want to start maybe with the first slide, which is the next slide, sorry, which is where Christina started off as well, which is to say for us at the Resource Center, the transition to a net zero carbon economy is itself a human rights imperative, and it drives so much of the work that we do looking at human rights impacts of companies globally. And we see the renewable energy industry as absolutely integral to that transition. And so the work that we do around renewable energy and human rights is in service of making that transition successful. We know that the renewable energy industry is critical to meeting our Paris climate goals, but also to achieving sustainable energy access for everyone around the world. So we want to see that transition happen, and we want to see it happen quickly, but we also want it to happen fairly. And we know that it can't come at the expense of the most vulnerable among us. Unfortunately, we are seeing in the renewable energy industry a large number of allegations of human rights abuse. And I'll talk about what those look like in a moment. But our fear is that if the industry does not get ahead of this problem and quickly tackle prevention, mitigation, and redress for harm, that it will have the same challenges that other industries have faced, including other energy industries, in terms of relationship with communities and workers, and ultimately slow down the transition to renewable energy and a low net carbon, zero carbon economy. So for us, this process is itself a human rights imperative. So if you can go to the next slide. As Christina mentioned, we have tracked since 2010 allegations of abuse related to renewable energy projects, nearly 200 of them on our website. And those allegations cross the spectrum of types of abuse, from killings and threats and intimidation of those who oppose projects, to land grabbing and other violations of land rights, to dangerous working conditions, and as Stephen highlighted so importantly, violations of Indigenous peoples' rights. One thing I like to point out with respect to human rights defenders, for the last 5 years, we have tracked attacks on human rights defenders who work on issues relating to business development. And in each of those years, the renewable energy industry has been either the third or fourth most dangerous sector for human rights activists to work in the company of industries like agribusiness and mining, and in some cases ahead of industries like the oil and gas sector. So that gives you a sense of the level of risk that activists face when they engage or oppose renewable energy projects around the world. The majority of allegations we're seeing are in Latin America, 61%, but we are seeing allegations of abuse happen in all regions of the world. You can go to the next slide, please. So why did we develop a benchmark? So over the last 3 or 4 years, we have conducted a number of surveys of renewable energy companies and talked to a lot of stakeholders. And what we found was that there wasn't a consistent set of expectations or a clear set of expectations for the sector in terms of a comprehensive assessment of risks and a comprehensive set of recommendations or standards in terms of how the industry addresses those risks. So we fell back on a methodology and an approach that we have used many times in the past through our participation in the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, which I know some of you are familiar with and use in your own work. And then we engaged externally with more than 100 stakeholders across civil society, industries, investors, and government to develop a methodology specific to the risks in the renewable energy industry. The way the benchmark is structured, as you can see, is that we start from a set of core indicators that are drawn directly from the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark and that relate directly to companies' most basic responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles. And then we build out from there to address indicators that tackle the risks that are most salient and most relevant to the renewable energy industry itself. You can go to the next slide. Some of those risks you'll see here, we've mentioned already, including Indigenous peoples' rights, land rights, and access to water, but also things like fundamental labor rights, women's rights, corruption, and the environmental impacts of renewable energy projects themselves. What we found generally is the risks associated with renewable energy projects often mirror or look similar to the types of risks we see in the extractive industries, merely because the land footprint of some of these activities tends to be very similar. And so you naturally have some of those similar types of risks when engaging with communities. You can go to the next slide, please. So we applied this methodology in a pilot benchmark that we released in June to an initial group of 16 companies. Those 16 companies are drawn from a list of the largest wind and solar producers in the world. And again, it's as Stephen mentioned, it's a sample of companies. It's a small group initially, but it gives us a very good sense of where the industry, and particularly the largest movers in the industry, are. So a couple of good news results out of that benchmark. You can see from the chart a very clear differentiation between companies, and that's really important. You can see clearly a group of about 4 leaders who have adopted human rights policies and who are thinking about these issues and are clearly in a leadership group. We've got a group of about 5 companies that are in sort of a catch-up group where clearly they have some of the appropriate policies in place, but they have a lot more to do. And then we have a long tail of laggard companies that, at least in terms of their policies, they have not addressed the specific risks related to the renewable energy industry. We were also happy to see that when we looked at just the corporate human rights benchmark core indicators, so the most basic responsibilities of companies to respect human rights, on average, the industry did on par with other high-risk industries. Again, that's a positive news story in that the industry is not behind other high-risk sectors, but it's important to think about the industry in the context of a high-risk industry. So they're doing similarly well to industries like the extractives, agriculture, apparel, and ICT manufacturing. So they have also a long way to go. Some of the less positive outcomes from our study, even the highest scoring companies only scored in the 40s and 50s out of 100. So there's a long way to go in terms of complete respect for human rights in operations and supply chains. Nearly half of companies scored below 10% and 3/4 scored below 40%. So many companies have not really even begun to grapple with the kinds of policies and practices they need to put in place to respect human rights. The average score was about 22%. But as I said, we were very happy to see some leaders, including Ørsted, who's joining our call today, clearly showing progress in adopting these human rights policies. You can go to the next slide, please. Finally, just to say a few areas where companies did particularly well and particularly poorly. As Stephen mentioned, companies did particularly poorly in areas where we saw the largest number of allegations of abuse, areas like land rights, just and fair relocation, land acquisition, and also Indigenous peoples' rights and FPIC. In some ways, this is not surprising because if there isn't a strong policy, it's unlikely there will be good practice. But it does show that relationship that we don't always see in benchmarks between policy and practice. And in good news, we did see companies scoring very well in some areas. Many companies have strong anti-corruption due diligence practices. They have strong health and safety disclosures, which are particularly welcome in the era of COVID and risks to workers. And many of them, 13 out of 16, have adopted a policy or a commitment to engage with stakeholders, which we see as a building block to achieving many of the other respect for human rights requirements that we see. So we do have some good news in some areas where companies are doing quite well. You can go to the next slide. I just wanted to briefly touch on 2 areas that I know are of interest to some folks on this call. One is around labor rights. We did not ask companies specifically about the just transition. We have a mix of companies in the benchmark some of whom are transitioning as a business away from fossil fuels and into renewable energy, and others that are 100% renewable energy companies. So we didn't ask them specifically about the transition of workers out of the fossil fuel industry. We did ask some more general fundamental labor rights questions. And here again, you'll see there's a ways to go. So we do have, as I said, a majority of companies doing good disclosures about health and safety, but only one company, BlackRock, that commits to paying its employees a living wage. And only a handful of companies that are really committed and active in closing the gender wage gap across their industry. So we have a ways to go on labor rights as well. And the next slide. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about supply chains, because I know this is an issue that's come up many times and is increasingly of interest to both companies and investors. And we did ask questions about how renewable energy industry companies are tracing their mineral supply chains. Unfortunately, none of the 16 companies in the benchmark received credit for identifying and assessing the human rights risks in their mineral supply chains in line with OECD guidance on responsible mineral sourcing. We did see 4 companies, including Ørsted, that did receive credit for at least acknowledging those risks. And I know that some of those companies are undertaking efforts to assess those supply chains. Excuse me. So we can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to offer up, while we were speaking to you all, one other resource that we have developed related to this issue of supply chains, and that is our transition minerals tracker. So we've seen an exponential increase in demand for some of these transition minerals that are used in renewable energy technology, including wind turbines, solar panels, and electric vehicles. And we know that those minerals are also frequently sources of abuse when mined. I apologize. And so our transition mineral tracker looks at the largest company producers of those minerals in those countries around the world and tracks those companies' human rights policies and human rights records. And we do that in a way that assesses what the major risks are in those industries, so that end user companies and investors like yourselves can understand where those minerals come from and what risks they need to be taking into account when they source from them. You can go to the next slide. And this is just a snapshot of some of those risks that we track coming from mineral supply chains, whether it's environmental impacts, access to water, or labor rights, and even tax avoidance. There's a lot more information about that tracing, that supply chain issue on the Transition Mineral Tracker, which is a link that we'll send you after the webinar. And finally, we'll go to the last slide, which is around recommendations to investors. And we have in the benchmark a number of general recommendations to investors when engaging with renewable energy company holdings or considering new holdings of renewable energy companies. And in fact, I will send you all a link as well to an investor briefing that we did last year that actually breaks out the salient risks as well as some positive and negative case studies for each of the renewable energy industry subsectors, wind, solar, hydro, etc., and lays out some specific questions and recommendations for investors in each of those sectors and across different types of investments. So I think that will be a very useful resource for all of you as well to consider with respect to your specific holdings. So I will be sure to send those resources around. I hope you find them useful. I will stop there and turn it back to Christina, but I look forward to your questions and engagement. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Marty. That was terrific. And we look forward to learning even more about what the Resource Center has to offer on this. So I'd like now to turn to Jens Christian Roth to hear a perspective from Ørsted, which is one of the leader companies. We really appreciate your being here.
Yes, thank you very much. A short introduction to how we in Ørsted approach human rights in our work. Before that, just a few notes on the company so you understand a little bit about our business and also a little bit about why we have the approach that we have right now. First of all, Ørsted is a company, an energy company with a headquarters in Denmark with around 6,500 employees. We have a revenue around $11 billion and 90% of that comes from our offshore business. So we're a global market leader in the offshore wind. We develop and build and operate these wind farms, but we also want to build our presence within other renewable energy markets such as onshore wind and solar and energy storage. In Denmark, we also have business within producing power and heat, and we are converting all our power plants from coal to certified sustainable biomass. So you can say, in the sense, we are right now primarily an offshore wind farm company, but growing into more onshore business in the coming years as well. So the way we approach human rights in Ørsted right now is that we have a very strong sustainability commitment. where we state clearly that we want to address the risk of human rights issues by operating very responsible in a safe manner and also with high integrity. And to do that, we have developed, you could say, a policy commitment through various policies that ensure that both we and also our business partners, primarily our suppliers, uphold ethical standards and respect human rights. We have developed this policy framework, you can say, guided by the UN Global Compact, where we've been a signatory member for the last 14 years, but also the UN Guiding Principles, as well as the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. We have done, or we do on a regular basis, we do human rights impact assessments, and the results shows us, at least from the last one we did, that the main risk is not in our own operations, it is more in our supply chain. So when we look at our own operations, we have certain risk, it's not very significant, but those risks are dealt with within different sustainability programs that then addresses those gaps, and those concrete programs we then report on in our annual sustainability report. When we talk about our supply chain, we have expanded primarily towards the APAC region, that is the Asian Pacific region, in particular in Taiwan, and that has meant that we needed to set up local supply chain because there is a localization requirement where we need to allocate a certain share of the total project value, you could say, in local supply chains. And through that, we have set up, you can say, supplier engagements, where we have seen that some of the issues that are dominant there are related to migrant workers, potential forced labor, but we also can see that some of the more cross-cutting issues that doesn't kind of only account for the Asian Pacific region related to commodities such as minerals and metals also take up a certain part of our, you can say, risk focus. And all these supply chain, you can say, issues we deal with through the program that I'm heading up, which is called the Responsible Business Partner Program. And that builds on our Code of Conduct for Business Partners, that we have a four-step approach to roll out towards our suppliers. We have, first of all, a risk, or not a risk, first of all, we have an acceptance phase where we communicate the Code of Conduct with our business partners and the suppliers to make sure that we have a mutual understanding what the expectations are. Then we screen all our contracts according to certain risk parameters to understand which of the suppliers that we need to engage further with through extended screenings, self-assessment questionnaires, or desktop assessments. The third step is then that we do also on-site assessments, and it's very deliberate that I call it assessments and not audits, because we think that the assessments are conducted in a more, you can say, trustful atmosphere, where it's not a pass or fail approach, but it's more focused on continuous improvement with those suppliers. Through those on-site assessment, then we can have an informed and good dialogue with suppliers and identify those areas where they potentially have issues or challenges in living up to the code. And then finally, the fourth step is then that we engage with the suppliers, where we develop implementation plans or improvement plans, and those improvement plans then guide the supplier and us in terms of where the supplier should put their focus in terms of living up to the Code of Conduct. So that's the dynamics of our program. But we also know that we have certain shortcomings when it comes to living 100% up to the UN Guiding Principles. And some of that is related also to our business footprint, where I said in the beginning that 90% of our business right now is from the offshore wind farms. And in those wind farms, we have a limited stakeholder exposure, you can say. So you can say, as we crawl back on land and develop more and more onshore projects, we will also have to develop our human rights approach to fit those risks that we see there. So that is kind of where we come from. We have a relatively solid approach with a good policy commitment and a good, you can say, programmatic response, but we also know that we continuously need to develop that response. And you can say the benchmark that Marty just introduced you to is a very good tool for us to understand where do we have shortcomings, where do we have gaps that we need to improve. And we use that internally in the company then to guide our approach and to understand where we need to develop further policy commitments or further governance structures or further programmatic responses. I think I'll stop for there, and then I'll be more than happy to take questions when we are ready for that.
Thanks very much, Jens. That was really informative and very interesting. So I am not seeing any questions in the question box. Please, I don't know if that's a technical glitch on our end, but if you have questions, please post them there because we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So I'm wondering if any of the other presenters have any further thoughts related to what any of what you've heard so far this morning. If you do, just please unmute yourself and feel free to Stephen, hi.
Yes, I wanted to ask Jens about just on your supply chain approach. That was one of the things in the benchmark report where Ørsted was called out for doing a good job on that. It sounds like you did an overall assessment and then you developed a supply chain as your main risk area, or how did you figure out to do that since most of your peers have not focused on supply chain?
So the supply chain program in Ørsted has been around for many years, you can say, and it's a program that was initiated, you can say, when we were a more fossil fuel intensive company, relying a lot on coal. So the coal supply chains that we had required that we had a supply chain program that enabled us to work with coal suppliers and make sure that we address those risks that were seen in the coal business. And you can say the program has been around then since that, but it has also continued developing in the transformation that the company has undertaken, where we have first of all sold off all our, you can say, oil and gas business, and you can say converting our coal-fired power plants to biomass. So instead of looking at coal now, we look at biomass suppliers, and instead of looking at gas, for example, we look at suppliers of foundation and cables, etc. So you can say it's a program with a long tradition in the company, but it changes as the company changes as well.
Thank you.
Christina, could I ask a question of Stephen?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry, I was muted. I was just asking you if you had any further thoughts.
I was gonna just ask Stephen if, given your long history of engagement on this, particularly on Indigenous rights, if you could share with us any positive examples you've seen, either of companies really engaging effectively with stakeholders and getting that input successfully, or of investors engaging with companies with that same purpose. If you could speak to either of those.
Well, not on the renewable energy area. There it's been more of the problematic areas, and talking with different companies, the ones that make the turbines, they've really viewed it as more of we just provide the turbines and it's the developers. So I think that is an issue that needs to be thought more about, companies and their responsibility if they're on a project. The other thing I think is the issue of relying on government approval. Well, we had the government approval, they had the consultation. Well, that's exactly what Energy Transfer Partners said with Dakota Access Pipeline. You know, we went through all this process, we had the approval, and then everything blew up on them, and you know, disaster for the company. So I would say that SQM and Albemarle on the lithium area have worked to try and improve their consultation in Chile, the sourcing of their, you know, the lithium from big ponds, and I think that's one area. I think it's an area that still needs to see more improvement on, is and for investors to be asking the questions.
Great, thanks. So we do have some questions rolling in. And the first one is for Stephen. The question is, can you explain how these criteria, I guess the criteria and the benchmark, play out in terms of your or Boston Commons decisions to invest in a company and engage if needed, or when to divest?
Sure, good question. Right now, looking at the initial 16 companies, we don't invest in most of those because of our guidelines on nuclear power. There are a lot of utilities in there that have nuclear power or coal-fired power, which is another area we look at. So it's one that we haven't started to use yet as far as for our guidelines. I think the thing that it would help is just looking at the top companies and saying, is there any reason why financially that we can't invest in them? So I think that's how we're going to use it right now. I would like to also point out what I mentioned before, the First Peoples Worldwide FPIC due diligence questionnaire. I think that's a good resource for investors to look in asking of companies and what they're doing. So it's very good for engagement, and the whole benchmark itself is a whole tool for engagement and noting what the gap areas are for companies and where they need to improve.
Great. Yeah, it might be worth having a webinar just on that tool. It sounds really useful. This question is for Jens. I'm interested in whether Ørsted finds the Business and Human Rights Resource Center benchmark useful, and specifically, do you agree about the area where the company scored poorly?
Yes, thank you for that question. I would say, as a sustainability professional, I have been working in many different companies and in different industries. I can say that Ørsted is a company that for sure is looking at how it performs on sustainability in general. You can see that when you look into our annual reports and on the different rankings that we are part of. And the Business and Human Rights Resource Center's Human Rights Benchmark is a welcoming, you can say, initiative from my perspective, because it is a good tool for me to bring into the organization and explain where we are, you can say, assessed only on public available information, where we are assessed on how we perform. Because very often we have you can say an idea, an understanding of that we are doing, you know, so good on different parameters, but when we are assessed only based on what is available publicly, it is for me a stronger case to kind of elevate the human rights agenda internally in the organization. And when you are you can say assessed towards peers in the industry, it becomes even stronger. So I can for sure use it internally to put focus on where we should improve as a company. I would say also that we have been engaged also in the hearing process around the methodology, and some of the questions we have discussed with the team, and maybe we don't agree on everything, but I think overall I think that the methodology is both relevant and where we score low, it is also a consequence of the fact that I said that we are primarily in offshore wind right now. So some of the parameters that we are measured on is maybe more for companies that are more active onshore, you can say, with a higher or with a larger presence in onshore renewable energy. And as we grow, of course, then we will need to close those gaps as well.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. So there was a request to show Marty's first slide again, so that's why we're going back to that. There may be a question about that. There's another question for Stephen. Does Boston Common invest in any lithium miners or producers currently? And if so, what are some of their human rights practices you would hold up for as best practices?
We do have some on Albemarle, which is a U.S. company that also has other product lines. They have operations in Chile. And then SQM, I think the issues that we brought up with both the companies is having formal policies, which they don't really have very much on that. They do say they have agreements with the different indigenous peoples around their operations in Chile. So I think that is one area. It's just that they are reporting on it in their report, like SQM is trying to use like a GRI style framework. So they do have some of the GRI ones on indigenous peoples. And the other part I think is on the they need to be more transparent about their agreements on compensation and revenue sharing. And I think that that's an area that SQM is doing a little bit on in Chile. But they say they have these agreements with these different indigenous peoples in their operations, but they can do a lot more on the transparency, and that's what that FPIC questionnaire by First Peoples Worldwide I mentioned. We used some of the questions in there and sent it to both companies, and there's just so much more that the company can do in this area.
Great, thanks, Stephen. You know, there's a question. Oh, yes, Marty.
Sorry, I just wondered if I could add a few sentences on that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
I was just gonna build on what Stephen said to say, in our tracker, we look at the 5 largest lithium producers, including the couple that Stephen just mentioned, and all 5 of them have had allegations of human rights abuse associated with their work. I think only one of the 5 actually has a formal human rights policy, or had at our last assessment a formal human rights policy. So I think that is a sector that has a ways to go. But as Stephen said, we've seen a lot of reports and new initiatives by some of these companies to engage communities, which I know from our work with those communities is certainly welcome. So we're starting to see a stronger interest from those companies and a recognition, but still a ways to go in terms of formal engagement.
Great, thanks. No, it's helpful. So there's another question, and it's sort of getting into this issue of engagement with stakeholders. This is for Jens. Can you explain more the way you work with stakeholders around offshore wind? Who owns, in quotes, the waters in which you place turbines? Good question. And with whom do you engage when determining offshore sites?
Yeah, I don't think that there's a general answer to who owns the water. I think, or there is, because it's states own projects that we bid into, and you can say those stakeholders that we primarily interact with in these projects are fishermen. So we have various initiatives to ensure both at the construction phase, but also the actual design of the wind farms are meeting the fishermen's requirements in terms of being able to continue their business, but also, of course, looking into the biodiversity within those farms to make sure that we respect that as well. So that means that we actually have a local community policy around this, where we have different local community funds that we also established to be able to support potential stakeholders that are affected by our projects. So I would say the main stakeholder group is fishermen, and we have a strong focus on engaging them throughout the different project phases.
Mm-hmm. So you have a clear process for determining whom you should consult with locally? Because there's a lot of questions around consultation, especially with, I know in oil and gas projects, there can be, the companies will say, well, we're consulting with the local community, but maybe they're consulting with part of the local community, but not everybody, especially those who may be opposed to the project. So how do you manage that, those questions?
We have actually a local consent team that is taking care of that, and as I mentioned, we have a policy that's called a local community engagement policy, where we do local impact assessments to understand where the main impact is seen, and then we have this community benefit fund that we establish to benefit the local communities. Hosting large construction projects, etc. So we have a constant team that is taking care of that, and that's actually outside my team, and that's also a good example of the fact that we actually have multiple programs in the company to manage the different parts of the value chain. I'm primarily focusing on right now on the supply chain, you can say, and then we also have for example, looking at health and safety. We have a health and safety team that is looking on that with suppliers, and then we have the, as I said, the constant team that is looking into the actual projects that we conduct, and they are the ones then that are responsible for conducting these due diligence processes.
Great, thanks. And you have a cross company or cross, sort of division process of communicating, obviously, with one another internally on this. Yeah. Great, thanks. So there's a question on impact investing. It says many investors have begun to focus on impact investing, and much of that investing is in the renewable energy space. So this is a question for Marty. How would you suggest that impact funds approach these investments to ensure that human rights are respected and projects truly have a positive impact for communities and the planet?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one of the reasons that we are so focused on investor engagement with this benchmark is because we know that the sector is a target for investors who have self-identified as having a social interest or social purpose in their investments. And that most investors who do focus on or invest in renewable energy are doing so because they believe in the just transition. And our purpose in raising awareness around this is to broaden the definition of that just transition, to make sure that those impact investors and all investors are thinking about both the E and the S in ESG, and really thinking about the human impacts as well as the planet impacts, people as well as planet, when they're making those social impact investments. And I think that, the expectations for companies are not different than or higher than expectations for companies in other sectors. Really what we're looking for are respect for the same principles that we would ask for in any industry. It's just that this industry, like the tech industry in some ways, grew very fast and very quickly and sees itself as a good citizen, and therefore doesn't necessarily think first about potential risks like human rights risks. And so it's really about raising awareness and putting the emphasis on the people as well as the planet when thinking about the growth of the company or the growth of the industry itself. So it's a bit of a mindset shift, but I think it's something that we really believe can be achieved. And this benchmark focuses on the largest companies in the sector because they're extremely influential and can set the pace and set the standard for the rest of the industry. But these approaches and standards are ones that can be applied to all companies, regardless of size, appropriate to their scale and their scope. So we really think the principles are the same across the industry, and we will really rely on investors, particularly socially responsible investors, impact investors, to push that message out to their companies.
Yeah, thanks for Stephen.
I'd like to add on that too, just the key area of ownership versus renting the land. That's the issue, like in North Dakota with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, that they're working with other tribal nations to have actual ownership of a utility scale type. So they get ownership of wind resource, or that they share ownership of who the developers are coming in rather than renting it. The situation that they've had before was they would only get a few cents for the wind, but then they're paying 13 cents a kilowatt hour for the power that comes in. It's crazy. So I think the ownership is an innovative new area that we'll see more of, whether it be in Mexico, United States, geothermal in Kenya. I know someone from the Maasai who's been trying to develop a Maasai-owned geothermal power in Kenya. That I think that's where you will have a true benefit for the community and besides for the earth.
Yeah, I just want to second that 100% what Stephen just said, and say that when we talk to communities as well that are sited near or at renewable energy projects, it's one of the largest complaints and frustrations we hear is how often the energy access itself simply bypasses the community, or they end up paying, as Stephen said, paying for it more than they're benefiting from it. And it's a source of extreme frustration, but also one that can be addressed through the right structure of the investment. And so it's a great point, not just making sure that the community actually benefits from the investment and the project itself, but actually giving the community a stake in, an ownership stake in, and a financial benefit from it as well is certainly an emerging best practice from our perspective too.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. This is something I think we're going to dig into a bit more on another webinar on offshore wind in Massachusetts, where we're going to look at labor issues and the potential for the development of the offshore wind sector for New England. Because we know that we've heard from Block Island residents, for instance, that a national grid project went through and there were consultations with the community, and the community thought they were going to get power from the project, and the cables completely bypassed them. They got nothing from the project except they can see the wind turbine. So they were deeply disappointed, and they're running, generators to produce electricity. So it's very sad, and clearly something for investors to raise with companies, and for utilities in particular to put policies in place so there are good practices moving forward. There's one more question. This is quite specific, but the question is, have business partners been considered as a risk factor in the benchmark? There are many renewable energy companies operating in occupied Western Sahara in partnership with Moroccan authorities and Moroccan companies without the consent of Sahrawi people. Sorry, I'm mangling the name, but it's not my area. But yes, that is, I mean, the question of occupied Western Sahara is a touchy one, so an important. Could anyone speak to that?
Yeah, just briefly, but I would be very happy to follow up. We follow a number of different human rights related risks in Western Sahara, most often related to some kind of natural resource development happening without local consent, whether that's renewables or extractive projects. That is a topic that we cover on our site, and I'm very happy to share some specific links to those stories. There's also some other organizations that I can share that track this issue of business investment in occupied territories more broadly, including in Western Sahara. So that's certainly a topic that we are following. And in terms of the benchmark, I think you'll see that in a number of places indirectly. One is looking at those supply chain issues in high risk environments and adherence to OECD guidelines around assessing risks in particularly high risk and conflict affected areas. That's certainly something that if a company were invested in a place like Western Sahara, you'd want to have a specific human rights impact assessment related to those supply chain risks or those direct investment risks. And then in other places like the corruption and transparency indicators just around the kind of business relationship itself is another place that we look at how companies engage with other companies in their supply chains and in their business partnerships.
And maybe I can just add one thing from the you can see from the machine room in Ørsted on our due diligence process here. We are not active in Africa, but with all our business partners, both those that we do joint ventures with, as well as with suppliers, we also do integrity screenings through our business ethics compliance team. Again, another team in Ørsted that performs you can say activities under the umbrella of sustainability, you can say, and they screen all business partners for potentially politically exposed people or trade sanctions, or whether or not there's been any convictions in any courts around corruption or bribery, etc. So as a company, at least, we also have a strong focus on that, and would never, you can say, embark on any collaboration with business partners that are flagged as red or high risk, you would say.
Great. Well, thanks very much. So we have a few minutes more before the top of the hour, and I'm wondering, we don't have any more questions. I would like to give each of you an opportunity just to make any final remarks or sum up where you think the most important issues are moving forward.
Maybe I just had one reflection earlier, and that was in relation to the benchmark that I said we use very constructive internally in the company. And I would say one additional thing that makes it very relevant for us right now to work with the benchmark is that there is at least in Denmark and in Europe in general, there is a debate around mandatory human rights due diligence these days. And you can say the benchmark in itself provides us with at least some more, you can say, information in relation to what would it mean if we had mandatory legislation on human rights due diligence. And that enables us to have a better discussion internally. What would our position be on this, and what would be the, you can say, the benefits or the challenges in relation to potential mandatory human rights legislation. So in that sense, also the benchmark comes very much in hand for us in our development of our program.
Oh, thank you. Good to know. I'd love to see that here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Marty or Stephen, any final thoughts?
Sure, I can go first. I'll let Stephen have the last word. Just to maybe reiterate a point I made earlier, and just to say that I think for us, when we look across, we cover all sectors and all industries in our work, and where we look and see the highest risks and the most relevant risks in terms of our work, we see this industry as a huge priority, and we consider it based on the allegations data and the scores in the human rights renewable energy benchmark to be a high risk sector. And so we're really encouraging companies and investors to think of themselves, as uncomfortable as that may seem, to think of themselves in that category of agribusiness and extractives and ICT companies, industries that have significant human rights risks, particularly because of the land footprint, but for other reasons as well, as we talked about in terms of supply chains, et cetera. And so again, that does not in any way mean the industry can't be successful and shouldn't expand very quickly. We support that, but it just means that that due diligence and risk assessment is critically important to make that expansion successful and rights respecting. So this will continue to be a focus for us in the coming years. Our work on the just transition more broadly, whether it's the operational side of renewable energy, human rights impacts, or the supply chain risks around transition minerals. We're continuing to look for ways to support that discussion and to put out new tools and resources for both companies and investors, as well as civil society, of course, to be able to assess and address those risks. And so you'll have my contact information at the end of this. We're very happy to be in touch as those resources become available, and also to help investors and companies use the ones that we have most effectively. So thanks so much for organizing, Christina.
Well, thanks. So we're really looking forward to working with you further on this, because we agree that it's a key sector. We need to build out renewable options very quickly, but absolutely it has to be done well. And yeah, Stephen, final thoughts.
Just that a lot of investors want a good financial return, but also hopefully a lot listening to today's webinar want to have a good social or environmental return. And therefore you have to look at everything in the benchmark and assess companies, not just on the product that they have, which in this case is renewable energy, but also is it really sustainable if it's abusing or exploiting individual communities, or leading to other harm in supply chains or mineral sourcing. Cobalt is a whole other area with electric vehicles. So I think that we just have to look at the whole package. As Jens said, have a commitment to continuous improvement and improving the supply chains, improving your portfolio company, improving the suppliers and your own operations, and just we keep learning to how we can do better. We're going to learn new things all the time, different issues, different countries, but just have a commitment to try to be constructive and addressing and improving these issues for communities and workers in these industries.
Well, thank you. On that note, I think we'll end. We're right almost at the top of the hour. Thank you so much again for your participation and for your work on these issues. It's very much appreciated, and I know our investor network will look forward to, as I said, digging in more. So thanks again. Thanks very much. Thanks all for participating.
Thank you.